Now we're on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis. What does this mean? Taharo Shel Mizbeach. Lav doesn't it certainly mean Palga de Mizbeach. Now, why does the word Tara or Tar mean Palga? And we'll see what that means. Kide Amri Inshi Tar Tara Liyom. When we're talking about midday, the terminology that's used by the local colloquial language is Taharo Diyoma. Tahar Diyoma means noontime, right? Noontime means exactly in the middle of the day, of the daylight hours. So the Gemara is asking the following question: since we have halacha of Hiza al Taharo Shel Mizbeach Sheva Pa'amim, which refers to Palga de Mizbeach, the middle of the Mizbeach. So we see that all the Shiva Hazoyos could not have possibly hit the middle of the Mizbeach. Some had to be applied above it and some below it. So we see again that we've proven that there is such a thing as part above and part below. Omarov Barshilo lo, that's not what it means. Agiluye. Agiluye means the gag of the Mizbeach. Dichsiv uke'etzem hashamayim lator. So tor here means cleanliness, right? It's sort of like similar to purity. And basically, the Torah is saying that just like the word purity means in Shmos Chaf Dalid, describing the Ziknei Yisrael at the time that Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the Har Sinai to receive the Torah. So purity means a description of the appearance of the heavens, a state of clarity. And the Mishnah uses the term in a similar way to allude that the Kohen Gadol was required to clear a section of the Mizbeach on top of the Mizbeach, clear out the coals and the ashes that were left there during the daily Haktoras, and sprinkle the dam on that purified surface. So you see that all the sprinkling was done on the top of the Mizbeach. So the Gemara asks, Va'ika Shirayim, let me find another opportunity to discover and establish a precedence where half the dam is on top, half the dam is on the bottom. Va'ika Shirayim, right? All the dam that was in the Mizrach is divided into two. Half of it was thrown onto the Mizbeach, and half went down to the Yisoda Mizbeach, which is called Shirayim, anything that was left in the Kli Sharetz. So Gemara says, Shirayim lo ma'akve. Shirayim, the way I understand the Gemara, is a separate independent mitzvah. It's already after the kapara of the korban, and it's not ma'akev, even if he didn't, if the blood got spilled or destroyed. We want to prove that within the context of the original avoda, and that mitzvah of avoda, you don't have anything that splits the zrika of the dam lamala and lamata. So Gemara asks, why ika shirayim apnimiyim di iko deman di omar ma'akve. So now we're going into chatos pnimios that are brought in the heichal, and there's one man di omar who holds that the dam of shirayim is likuva. It's an absolutely critical dam. So here, in terms of the avoda, inside the heichal of the chatos pnimios, we're going to have part of the dam going lamala, on top of the Mizbeach Hazav, or on top of the Kapores or the Parochas, whatever the case may be. And part of it is Shirayim that goes down to the base of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara answers, B'chad Mokom Kamrinon. While it's true that there is a halacha of Shirayim, which according to one Mandi Omar, the Shirayim is ma'akev, but the shirayim is ma'akev when it's poured on the outer mizbeach, on the mizbeach hanechoshes, so that the sprinkling of the dam is done inside the heichal, on the kapores, on the paroches, and so forth, but the shirayim is done outside the Heichel on the Mizbeach HaChitzoni. And where do we find Dam Lamal and Dam Lamata? That's Likuva in the same location. Fine. Tanya, we learned in the Brayso of Elazar of Yaakov over Beit Shammai Omer. Now we're going back to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Let's just reiterate the machlokas, which is the first Mishnah in our perek. Number one, according to Beit Shammai, you need a minimum of 2 zrikos for a chatos, and according to Beit Hillel, a chatos is no different than any other carbon, and 1 zrika is critical, is sufficient. Beit Shammai omer shtei matonos shebechatos ve'achas bechol hazvachim matiros umefaglos. Now let's understand that double language, matiros umefaglos. Matiros means we're trying to determine which of the matonos will generate the heter that will allow us to eat the basar, allow us to consume the basar on the mizbeach. And the answer is it depends which matonos are absolutely critical. So that according to Beit Shammai, matiros would refer to, in the case of chatos, would refer to 2 different zrikos. And the combination of those 2 will be matir the korban. What's mafaglos? So mafaglos would mean the following, that according to Beit Shammai, in the case of chatos, you would need a machshavas chutz l'zmano to be mafagel in both of the nesinos, not in one. Because if you only had one, then we have a principle that ein pigel b'chatzi matir. And according to Beit Shammai, in the case of chatos, 1 single nesina is only a chatzi matir. Beis Hillel omrim achas shebechatos ve'achas shebechol zvachim materes umfageles. According to Beis Hillel, on the other hand, the Mishnah records he debates and rejects Beit Shammai, and he holds no. Just like 1 single zrika is likuva in all korbanos, the same thing we apply to chatos. And therefore, we only need 1 zrika to be matir, the basar, and we need a machshavas pigel to be mafagel in 1 single matana. Maskifla Rav Oshaya, Rav Shaya has a kasha on this machlokes in Cain. If you can assume that according to Beis Shammai, in the case of chatos, you need a machshavas pigel for both zrikos, for both 2 zrikos. According to Beis Hillel, a machshavas pigel to generate pigel would be sufficient, even in the case of chatos with 1 matana. And he had a machshav chutz l'zmano. Listening gabi kuli Beit Shammai chum Beis Hillel. There's a Masechta called Edios, and in Masechta Edios, there's a list of those cases in which Beis Hillel, those exceptional cases in which Beit Shammai is mekil. And here, this should have been listed. Why? Because if he had a machshavas pigel according to Beit Shammai and a chatos with 1 zrika, it would not be pigel. And if somebody went ahead and ate the basar, he would not be chayiv kares. So that's a kula of Beit Shammai. Honestly, Rabbosai, I don't understand the Gemara's kasha. I think there's a very simple answer to the Gemara's kasha. Yes, it's true that according to Beit Shammai, there's a kula in terms of pigel. But the chumrah, the basic thrust of Beit Shammai is a chumrah, that there's no kaparas chatos with 1 nesina, you need 2. And I think that's more or less what Rav is about to tell us. Amalei Rava, ki itchel, in other words, when the issue came up between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, it wasn't about pigel, but rather lehetera itchel. In other words, the question was, at what point is the nesina, the matana, sufficient to be matir the basar? The Havale Beit Shammai l'chumra, so Beit Shammai were machmirim. They said, no. In chatos, 1 matan is not enough to be matir the basar. We need 2 matanos. So fundamentally, Beit Shammai is a mekil. I'm sorry. Fundamentally, let's take that again. Beit Shammai is a machmir, because in order to be matir the basar, the heter is suspended, is held up until he has 2 matanos. Whereas Beit Hillel is the mekil, and the heter is chal immediately after 1 matan alone. Again, as a result of this, Beit Shammai will be mekil and pigel, but that's only a secondary outcome of the fundamental issue. Oh, Rabbi Yochanan, shalosh matanos shebechatos. Oh, now here's interesting. This opens up a whole new sugya. I mean, I shouldn't say a whole new sugya, but a whole new branch of our sugya. Since we came to the conclusion that according to Beis Hillel, even in the case of chatos, one matana is critical. The other three matanos are only lemitzvah. They don't have the same status as the first nesina. So now the question arises, so what is the status of these three extra matanos? For example, we know that the dam has to reach the mizbeach before shkiyas achama. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Einon Bos Balayla, even these three additional matanos to make up the number 4, which are not critical, nevertheless they have to be done by day. You cannot apply these extra 3 matanos, the last 3 matanos, by night. And why is that? Because the dam itself becomes possible with shkiyas achama. Ubal siachar misa. Here we find a fundamental differentiation between the first matana and the other 3. Again, it's a crazy kind of case, but in Shas we have to deal with every possible phenomenon. And what happened is that after the Kohen applied the first matana of the chatos on one of the chronos, at that point the owner of the carbon never dropped dead. And now the question is, we have halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai called chatos hamesos, which means that if the bailim of the chatos dies, then the carbon is possible. And here says Rabbi Yochanan, I don't care one way or the other. The carbon still remains kosher because the first matana was given, and that generates the kapara of the carbon. And now the other 3 matanos on the other 3 corners of the mizbeach are only lemitzvah, and therefore the halacha Moshe Sinai of chatos hamesos does not apply in this case. And number 3, hamayle behem bichutz chayav. And once again, Rabbi Yochanan is upgrading the status of the other 3, similar to that of the first one, which generates the kapara and is critical. And he says, even with regard to the other 3, if you take the dam outside the azara, that's going to be mechayev you a chiyuv, I think it's kares, if I'm not mistaken, for avodas chutz. Let's see if he tells you. Yeah, kares. Kares also means chatos if he did it b'shogeg. So that's called avodas chutz. Omar Rav Papa. Rav Papa, based on Rabbi Yochanan, is going to expand it. And he's going to have an entire list, I think it's 7 in number, if I'm not mistaken, of halachos that apply to the last 3 matanos, upgrading them to the same status as the first. And that's called yesh mehem b'tchilaso. Tchilaso means like the first matana, which is absolutely critical. And yesh mehem kisofa. However, we're going to have 3 other halachos in which we're going to differentiate fundamentally between the first matana and the last 3. So first he goes with the kitchilasa. Number 1, chutz v'layla. If he takes the dam and he does the avoda outside the azara, chayiv kares. Number 2, laila, the other 3 have to be done at night. And again, this is all just an extension of what we saw in Rabbi Yochanan. Zarus, if a non-Kohen does the avoda, even if he does the avoda of the last 3 zrikos, matanos, he's chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. Ukli shares, and the last 3 matanos have to be done from a kli shares, just like the first one, which is called kitchilaso, and keren, and etzba. Right? With regard to chatos, the Kohen is required to put his finger into the dam and apply the dam onto his back with his finger. And chronos, they have to be given on the other 3 chronos of his back. Kibbutz. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kibbutz. This is a parsha in the Torah. Let's just see if he tells you where to look. Yeah, he says, look in Vayikra Perek Vav. And there's going to be an entire Perek in Maseches Zevachim, which is called Dam Chatos, on the halacha of kibus. What happens to kibus means that if the dam is royal avodas hamizbeach and it sprinkles onto his beged, then that beged has to be subjected to kibus, to washing it out. And again, what the laws of kibus is, as I said before, there's an entire chapter. It's a short chapter, but a very lumdish chapter called Dam Chatos. Now, the avoda of the last three matonos in Chatos qualifies as an avoda. And therefore, if the dam from any of those three, let's say, for example, after he shechted the Chatos, he was makabel the dam in one kos, in another kos, in a third, in a fourth. So the four kosos. If any of the dam of any of those four kosos gets sprinkled accidentally on his beged, they require kibus because they're still royal avoda, because even though the kapar of the carbon is clinched with the first matana, but nevertheless, the Torah requires the avoda to continue with the dam of the other three kosos. Then we have shirayim. Shirayim, as we said before, is after the zrika, whatever remnants of dam are left in the klishares, they have to go down to the base, have to be poured on the base on the Yesod HaMizbeach. Now, we said that after he shechted the chatos, he receives the dam in four kosos, and then he's going to apply the dam from one kos to one keren, second kos to another keren, and he's got four matanos on four chronos. Each one of these kosos has shirayim. And Rav Papa is pointing out that shirayim is subject to and included in the mitzvah of shvichas shirayim, of pouring the dam onto the Yesod HaMizbeach. And the reason for that is because, as we said before, it's still royal avoda, and the dam has to be brought onto the Mizbeach. Kitchi Losan. Now Rav Papa says, where do we find a fundamental difference, a contrast between the last three matanos and the first? Number one, Misa, that we saw already in Rabbi Yochanan, that if he dies after the first matana, then nevertheless the carbon is kosher. Number two, Lo Sharia. That's an interesting phrase, but basically what it means is that I don't need any of the last three matanas to be matir, the basar, because we already had the first matana. V'lo mefagla, and if he has a machsheves chutz lizmano in any of those three avodos of matanos 2, 3, and 4, it's not mefagla the carbon because the carbon is already kosher. Once the carbon is kosher through the kapara of the first matana, there's no possibility of being mefagla. V'lo ayla ligavoy. Is so fun. Okay. Certainly, you're not allowed to bring the dam of the other three into the heichal, because any dam that's subject to avodas chutz cannot be brought into the heichal. But nevertheless, even though normally when you bring the dam of a chutz into the pnim, into the heichal, it passes the carbon, but not in the case of the other three, because it's kisofan, and he already has achieved the kapar, the carbon, with the first zrika. Omar Papa, you know, aminalin. How do I know that the dam of the last three karbanos, the last three matanos, if it reaches the garment, generates a mitzvah of kibus? This not, I learned it from a Mishnah. And this Mishnah is way later on in Masechta Zevachim. It says, Nitaz minat savra ala beged. Okay, now let's follow what goes on over here. When the blood reaches the beged, there are two possibilities. Either it's blood that was never in a klishares, or it was blood that reached the klishares and then was spilled on his garment. So the first case, where it never reached the klishares, is called nitaz minat savra ala beged. Somehow, after the Kohen shechted the animal and the blood is spurting, it spurts onto his beged. So it was never sanctified for the Mizbeach through a klisharis. And therefore, enoton kibus. Such dam does not generate a mitzvah of kibus. It's only dam that's royal in Mizbeach. However, min hakerem u'min hayesod. Now we have the other extreme. What happens if the dam was already implemented? The avodah was already implemented, and the dam now, after it's put on the keren hamizbeach, or in the case of shirayim on the yisod hamizbeach, now it sprinkles onto his garment. You don't need kibus. When do you need kibus? Homin aroy keren ton kibus. If the dam spurted onto his beged, when it's roy lekibus, when it's roy lekeren, meaning he's got the dam already in a klishares. So once the dam is collected in a klishares, it's now roy lekeren, meaning now you could do the zrika with it. If that dam, which is roy, and the mitzvah wasn't yet fulfilled, spurts onto his beged, it requires kibus. Comes along Rav Papa, and he says that from this Mishnah, we should derive the conclusion, because the Mishnah said min hakeren u'min hayesod, that min haroy lekeren or roy leyesod, that's Rav Papa's addition to this Mishnah, then ton kibus, right? Because the complete avoda would be when he does the shvichas dam onto the shirayim of the dam onto the soda mizbeach. Now, roy lekeren means any of the dam that should be sprinkled onto the kronos. And Rav Papa understands that includes all four kosos, meaning all four kronos, because the dam is required to be sprinkled on onto the mizbeach. So again, even though the last three kosos are not critical, and the kapar of the carbon would be clinched and was clinched by the first matana, nevertheless, the other three require a zrika al gabi mizbeach, and therefore, if they fall onto the beged, they generate kibus. That's how Rav Papa understood this mission. So Gemara says l'tameich, although you only made this comment regarding the dam in the three kosos before the zrika, many yesod edo tod kibus, hamina royal yesod tod kibus. You should use the same methodological diuk or interpretation of the Mishnah to apply to the yesod, and therefore you would have to conclude, Rav Papa, that even the dam that remains in the klishares in the last three kosos after the zrika, that dam is roy le yesod, right? It's roy for shvichas shirayim al hayesod, and therefore it should generate. If it falls onto the beged, it should generate kibus. That can't be though. Why? Because asher yizek siv in the parsha of kibus, the Torah says that the blood needs hazah, and if it needs hazah, and some of the blood that needs hazah, that's lends itself to a subject that requires hazah, now falls on your garment, then you need kibus. That's to exclude prat lezeh shekvar huza. But if the dam was already sprinkled on the mizbeach, then there's no chiv kibus. But yet, according to your understanding, Rav Papa, the Mishnah, then we should derive the conclusion that a roy lit yisod ton kibus. And the Gemara answers, Hamani Rav Nechemya, that maybe we're going to have to attribute this Mishnah to Rav Nechemya Disnan. We learned in a Mishnah at the end of Maseches Zevachim that Rav Nechemya Omer Shiori Adam Shekrivo Bachutz Chayim, that Rabbi Nechemya upgrades the status of shirayim, meaning even after the dam in this kos was already sprinkled on the mizbeach, you're left now with remnants. Even those remnants, if you take it out of the azara, then you chayev for chutz, and you'll be chayev kares, as we said before. And therefore, the Gemara thinks that we should maintain the following equation. If Rabbi Nechemia upgrades the dam of roy l'shirayim to the same status as dam haroy l'zrik al gabi mizbeach, he upgrades that status. Haraya, he holds that just like if you take the dam haroy l'zrika outside of the azor yechayev kares, so too if you take the dam that's roy l'shvicha shirayim ala yisod outside of the azor yechayev, and therefore the same mitzvah of kibuz should apply both to the case, or equally to the case of dam haroy l'zrika, as it should apply to shvichas dam al yisod. However, the Chachamim rejected Rabbi Nechemia. They hold that dam of shvicha does not generate a chiyuv chutz, and therefore they would also hold that dam of shvicha, meaning the remnants of dam in the kos, in the klisharis after the zrika, would not generate a mitzvah of kibbutz. So the Gemara doesn't like it, and the Gemara says, "Eimor deshamet leila Rabbi Nechemia linyan halah." Rabbi Nechemia only made his statement with regard to shchutei chutz, and he postulated, opined, if you want to use it, that the dam of shirayim, the dam that's royal l'shvicha shirayim, if it's taken by chutz, generates a chiyuv of kares for chutz. But midi have evar p'tarim, and basically Rabbi Nechemia had a precedent because Evarmu Pedarim, which have to be burnt on the Mizbeach, they're subject to Haktorah, and that Haktorah takes place after the Zrika Saddam, which means after the Kapara was already clinched. If you would take the Evarmu Pedarim outside of the Azara, be maktir them b'chutz, you'd be chayav kares, right? And therefore, Rabbi Nechemia, based standing on the shoulders of Evarmu Pedarim, extended it to the Dam of Shirayim, because we already have a breakthrough and a precedent that even after the machaper of the Zrikas Hadam al Mizbeach was clinched, nevertheless there could be a chiyuv chutz, and therefore Rabbi Nechemia applied that to the case of Shvicha Shirayim, meaning Shvicha Shirayim is no different than Haktoras Evarim U'Pedarim, and therefore it lends itself to the Iser Kares of chutz. But in kibbutz mishametli, you can't commit Rabbi Nechemia to hold that the dam of shirayim is a dam that generates the mitzvah of kibbutz. And the Gemara says, I'm going to prove to you that Rabbi Nechemia goes explicitly on record as holding that the dam of shirayim requires kibbutz. Here we'll just start a little bit here on Daf Lamed Tes. But Tanya, because we have a brisa, and the brisa says, "Domim atu'unim yisod," right? The remnants of the dam in the kos after the zrika are tu'unim kibus. If they fall on the beged of the kohen, then machay of the mitzvah of kibus. So we have here a brisa that explicitly maintains. And we're going to see that this brisa can only be attributed to Rabbi Nechemia, but it maintains that the dam of Shirayim generates kibus. Umachshavamo eles bohen. Okay, this is impossible. There's no way you can interpret this literally. What do you mean machshavamo eles bohen? You're talking about pigul? How could there be pigul in the dam of Shirayim? Shirayim means he already did the zrik al gabi mizbeach. There's no room. There's no what word do I want to use? There's no place for pigul. Okay, we'll have to see about that. The Gemara is going to pick that up. Machshava moelis b'hem, could it be? But right now, hamayla b'hem b'chutz chayev. Okay, so that we know that Rabbi Nechemia is of the opinion that if you take the dam of Shirayim and you bring it outside the Azara, you're chayev. V'damim nishpachim la'ama. If a carbon becomes possible, what do we do with the dam? in such a case, the remnants of dam are not poured chas v'sholem on the mizbeach, the Yisoda mizbeach, but rather they go out ba'ama. There was a canal that led to way outside the Mikdash, and that dam was used as fertilizer. Einam tunim kibus. If such dam from a korban posel would fall on the beged, it doesn't generate a mitzvah of kibus. They machshav else behem v'mayil behem b'chutz potter. Man shamet leiti omer mayil behem b'chutz chayav. Then if you take the dam of Shirayim and you bring it outside the Azara, you're chayav. Who is that? It's Rabbi Nechemia. It's only Rabbi Nechemia. The Chacham rejected it. And nevertheless, it says ton kibus, that if that dam falls on the beged, so you see that Rabbi Nechemia is consistent in one issue. What is the status of dam haroi l'shficha al gabi yisoda mizbeach? Is it dam or is it not? Is it dam haroi la'avoda? Again, in a more generic, all-inclusive term of avoda, meaning that shvichas dam al yisoda mizbeach is called and qualifies as avoda. By the way, this could have implications as far as whether you need a Kohen for that. We're going to have to see. And once Rab Nechemia committed himself to chutz, that means if you take the dam of the Shirayim outside the Azor Yechayev, that means he upgraded and equated the status of dam Shirayim with dam. It's dam of avodah in the full sense of the term, and therefore it generates a chiyuv kibus. Okay, then. So again, Chodesh Tov, and same time tomorrow. Oh, tomorrow is what day of the week? Is Thursday. So tomorrow is Tohar, right? We said that Tohar splits the day into two parts.